Um, Thank you very much for coming. My name is Jeff Tarnowski. I'm faculty in the French and Italian Studies Department and co-director of the Textual Studies program. And very happy to welcome you to this year's Digital Humanities Lecture, sponsored by the Simpson Center, co-sponsored by UW Textual Studies. And I wanted to start by thanking the staff of the Simpson Center for all of their work and support making this event happen. Caitlin Palo, Yazi Nagiri, Abby Dean, and Kathy Woodward and Rachel Artiaga, thank you so much for all the help and the support for an event like this, which I think is very meaningful to us. And it's a pleasure to introduce Ryan Cordell. Ryan is Associate Professor in the School of Information Sciences in the Department of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Before that, he was faculty at Northeastern University, where he co-founded the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. And I bring that up because, Northeastern has long been at the vanguard of digital humanities work in the US, and Ryan's work there is kind of coming out of that context is very reflective of how influential his work has been over the past, decade or so. Ryan has worked in particular with historic US newspapers, looking for patterns of circulation as these can be traced and analyzed by applying computational methods to digitize text stored in large repositories. For example, at the Chronicling America database at the Library of Congress. And one of the patterns he's been most interested in is perhaps this question of text reuse. This is at a time in the US when copyright was not a very strong regulatory framework, and newspapers were liberally reusing stories and articles and other items from other papers. This work led to the collaborative Viral Text Project, which was funded by the NEH and the ACLS. The project traces the migrations of text from one paper to the next, looking at patterns of influence and clusters of similarity, also at how text changed in and through their travels. As Ryan put it in a video summary at the project website, at that Viral Text Project website, Viral Text, quote, uses the affordances of computation to unravel the messy textual history of 19th century information exchange. And the work has also led, of course, to a series of publications by Ryan on text reuse and virality, but also on the broader impacts, I would say, of digitization on contemporary research, including the role of OCR. He's written a number of very important reports on using OCR with historical and multilingual materials and on machine learning and libraries for the Mellon, for the NEH, and for the Library of Congress. I've often taught. Some of you have had the pleasure to read these texts that I've assigned and been influenced by Ryan's work and his insights into how today we should, with methodological rigor and understanding, deal with the expansive and kind of continuously expanding archive of both digitized and born digital materials, which we find ourselves always working with, though often without fully, maybe sufficiently acknowledging what we're working with and what we know about these digital materials. So I think we'll hear the continuation of this reflection today, now applied to the next thing that we're all trying to figure out, which is large language models and generative AI. And before I invite Ryan to come up here, I just want to make a parenthetical note. Ryan is also very interested and involved in letterpress and book arts. Been talking a lot about that. And Ryan's coming to our book arts class tomorrow morning to talk about this kind of other facet of his work, and maybe other isn't really the quite right word to use here, which I haven't really talked about. Talk about more tomorrow. But running the Skeuomorph Press at the University of Illinois, he'll talk about what that means to him as a digital humanist and the role of letterpress in this kind of age of data and digitization. And I bring that up. We have limited space. It's in a more constrained space than we're in today in the special collections classroom. But if anyone's interested in coming to that, just let me know, and I can give you details. Be at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Ryan's title, drawn from the great D.F. McKenzie, is Bibliography and the Sociology of Large Language Models. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Cordell.
Oh, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I appreciate speak with you all and the work of the folks here at the Simpson Center for the Humanities. in making it possible. So I'm going to launch in. I've got a lot of sort of wide-ranging set of ideas that I want to try to move between today. So let's get going. Make sure the clicker works. It does. Beautiful. In 1884, the British printer and publisher Andrew W. Toyer published what he called, sort of indelicately for modern sensibilities, a midget folio of printer's jokes, reprinted from the Paper and Printing Trades Journal. His book was called Quads for Authors, Editors, and Devils. And I will say that I've long known that this book existed, and I did know that it was a small book, but recently I convinced our Rare Book and Manuscript Library to purchase a copy. And all I said when I first saw it was, "Oh my God, it's so tiny." I want to point our attention here to start because of a tiny illustration in the tiny book. And you can see here, how small it is, in fact. Titled The New Steam Compositor, this fanciful illustration shows an automaton, steam rising from a brazier at its feet and through its body to emerge from a teapot-shaped head as it stands before a type case, setting movable type from copy suspended from its head, which reads the Paper and Printing Trades Journal, which is the publication from which the printing humor in this book was drawn. The compositor was, in the print shop, the person who set copy, whether an author's manuscript or a printed work that was being reprinted, into movable type, preparing it for the press. And the new steam compositor channels an idea, for some a hope, for others a fear, that was widespread in the print industry of 1884, that any moment the compositor's job would be supplanted by an automatic typesetting machine that would be faster, more reliable, and cheaper than human labor. For decades, printers and inventors have been working to make this idea a reality, often accompanied by breathless reporting about the next great communications revolution that was fast approaching. In a separate article in progress, I trace this lineage of hype and deflation through a series of inventions over nearly 50 years. While that history is not going to be my central theme today, I do want to gesture towards this discourse because I see in the hopes and fears about automatic typesetting some useful parallels with our own discourse about automatic writing in the 21st century. And I'm going to begin with one newspaper article to help outline what we study in the Viral Text Project that's related to this. And I know that folks won't be able to read every word. I'll try to pull out important details. In the 1860s, several newspapers adopted and reported about a machine built by an American inventor named Timothy Alden that would, it was claimed, do the work of 5 human typesetters in an hour. To be transparent, these predictions were proved premature. In the US alone, more than 30 patents were granted for automatic compositors between the 1860s and the 1890s, all of which ultimately proved over those decades too unwieldy for regular use and too intricate to maintain. Alden's machine was especially complex, and after he unexpectedly died shortly after the machine was actually built, it proved impossible to maintain and to keep the existing machines working. But in 1866, hopes were still high. And this article explicitly compared the work of the machine to human cognition, claiming, "The almost universal belief hitherto has been that till mechanism could be made to think, it could not be made to supply the place of human eyes and fingers and brains in fixing the intelligent juxtaposition of types for printing. But, quote, the Alden machine has overcome the limit beyond which it was thought machinery could not go." This article was reprinted at least 45 times in US newspapers. The original longer version of the article that appeared in some papers, such as the New York Daily Tribune, opened, quote, "There are 2 things which hitherto it has been held could not be done by machinery, to think and to set type." The article speculates that, quote, "if an editor or parson could put a quire of paper under his pillow or in his hat and find, after due and patient waiting, that the writing had been done automatically, quote, it would be questioned whether the world would be benefited thereby." We can return to that skepticism when we think about automatic writing in 2025, but for now I want to focus on how this article exemplifies the work of newspaper production in the 19th century. So as Jeff mentioned, at this time, newspaper content was explicitly not protected by intellectual property laws. And I want to frame it that way. It's not that it was accidentally left out of intellectual property laws. The laws were constructed to ensure that material would be public domain. In the United States, editors took advantage of favorable postal rates. It was free for an editor to get any newspaper in the mail. That was designed so that they could get this material for reprinting, and they would trade papers with each other for reciprocal use. Compositors filled their daily, weekly, or more occasional issues with selections from other newspapers on what were called their exchange lists. That was the list of papers that they swapped with, either that they received or that they sent their papers to. And the editor sifted through all of these exchange papers for content. So a piece like The Alden Machine jostled for attention on the same page as bite-sized news. I call this like tweet-sized news, although that's now outdated, but I've always referred to it that way. Sentimental domestic reflections, that this is more news, sorry. Sentimental domestic reflections about the first baby in a household. Random trivia and factoids. Before I started this project, I thought that the listicle was a internet genre. The listicle is a very common genre in 19th century newspapers. Popular health advice here about how to avoid the cholera. Agricultural tips, like chloroform to tame your bees. I don't know if I recommend that, but they do. Agricultural tips, science and technology articles, such as about new weapons of war that have been in use in recent battles, and jokes, such as down in the corner. I'm going to talk more about jokes later. 19th century jokes never translate well to the present, but we'll get back to them. There were lots of jokes. Political commentary. I thought actually this was going to be apropos because it's about the Northwest, but by the Northwest they mean where I live, Illinois. They do not mean Washington yet. This is also political commentary. Petroleum v. Nasby was a very famous satirical writer at the time. He was a Northern writer who wrote as a stereotypical Southerner to sort of make fun of the slaveholding South and then to make fun of the Confederacy. This is a Nasby piece. And of course, most newspapers included poetry and fiction, both serialized fiction and short fiction. This is a Longfellow poem randomly on this page, but often it was anonymous or by writers who we don't pay much attention to anymore. One of the most exciting things for me about work we've done in viral text has been all of the poetry that we discover that is not anthologized or really thought about by literary scholars very much anymore. And just sort of moving along, a letter from Horace Greeley, kind of anecdote that may or may not be true. There's a lot of this sort of quasi-truthful, quasi-fictional content in the news. And then here is that Alden typesetting machine article. Like a 21st century social media feed, the newspaper was a single medium for nearly every genre of content. And it was often presented without evident organization. One of the reasons we called our project Viral Text early on is because when I look at these newspapers, it feels to me a lot more like reading a social media feed where you just have so much different kinds of content back to back to back than it does like the kind of organized newspaper of the mid-20th century. It's a very different kind of text. So these are just some examples of the kinds of selections that we discover through the Viral Text project, which I've been working on for about a decade, starting with my co-PI David Smith at Northeastern University, and which we continue now that I am at the University of Illinois. We were initially founded by a digital humanities startup grant from an office that no longer exists, a grant program that no longer exists. I feel the need to call that out right now. I'm not sure how someone would start a project like this in 2025, but I'm glad that we were able to. Growing from early experiments on pre-Civil War American newspapers, Viral Text is now mining data from more than 20 large-scale historical periodicals archives. including papers from North America, Europe, and Australia, and from the 19th and now early 20th centuries. And we use this data to explore different facets of 19th century periodical culture, from the popular genres and authors that primarily circulated through newspaper reprinting, to the topics that generated the most discourse in the paper, to the ways that reprinting can help us understand the information flow across the country during these periods. I'm not going to discuss our core data mining methods today, but those who are curious can learn more by visiting our website, where we link to a lot of our publications. You can look at the work of the various researchers who have been affiliated with the project over its years. We have a book that is almost done, but all of the chapters that we've written thus far are online at the University of Minnesota's website. So you can look at those chapters. If you're interested in our core text mining methods, that's chapter 2, just to sort of seed that. Or you could spend some time with a database that we launched just last year, which provides search access to our core findings. So if there's a text you're curious whether it was reprinted in the 19th century, you can go see if we've discovered any reprints of that text in this database. In this talk, what I want to do, though, is connect the messy textual ecosystem of 19th century newspapers to large language models, such as most famously ChatGPT, but we'll be talking about others today. In a 2023 book history article, Sarah Bull links the rise of what she calls bookmaking in the 19th century as a category separate from authorship, to the birth of the content generator, and eventually the ideas of textual content that underlie 21st century technologies like large language models. By separating what she calls, quote, two discrete categories of labor, the intellectual creative and the bodily mechanical, Bull argues that 19th century writers, editors, and publishers, quote, popularized the idea that all text and anything that could be rendered into text was content, alienable filler for a medium, in this case the book, and that this material could be generated pretty much automatically. I will argue that the newspaper exchange system offers a similar analog as a method of textual production founded on the selection, adaptation, and recontextualization of existing prose and poetry. If we consider the full network of papers that constituted the exchange system and the millions of densely composed pages that were exchanged through it each year, the 19th century newspaper was perhaps the largest text generation platform in human history, and it offers both lessons and warnings for our current discussions of large language models. Like LLMs, 19th century newspapers blended original and unoriginal writing in ways that were difficult for their readers to immediately apprehend. And that reality led to similar and warranted anxieties about veracity, attribution, and reliability to those that we face today. In the Viral Text Project, we take our website's own headpiece from an illustration that appeared in Harper's Weekly in January of 1874, which depicts the editor of the fictional Podunk Weekly Bugle considering whether to accept these two chickens as payment for a year's subscription to the paper. As the accompanying article notes, the payment of a little hard cash would be more useful to this editor. While it is condescending to its subject, as the title Podunk Weekly Bugle should suggest to us, the article nonetheless praises the small rural papers that made up the majority of the newspaper network and were, quote, the only means by which many of their readers receive intelligence of what is going on in the great world outside. In the illustration, we see the scissors and the paste pot on the editor's desk, sitting aside clippings from other newspapers that he's considering for inclusion in the paper. And this is over and over again, the central activity that is ascribed to editors. This is what they did. These were their tools. In his garbage can are clippings that did not make the cut, quite literally. And behind the subscriber, or the potential subscriber, if I can get it to move, there we go. We see the compositor setting type from a pasted up clipping. So that's a clipping that he's looking at and resetting that piece in type. In a popular selection that made the rounds in the 1860s, often called out as from an exchange, the editor of a country newspaper rebuffs charges of poverty by declaring, among other things, we have a good office and a paste pot. Another selection provided a recipe for making paste and noted, quote, next to scissors, paste is an invaluable editorial assistant, before praising the creator of this new recipe for paste as, quote, a Godfrey, a Franklin, a Fulton, a Davy, or a Morse. comparing them to other famous inventors. While certainly some contemporaries criticized scissors and paste journalism, the frequency with which practitioners highlighted the scissors and paste signaled that they valued selection and aggregation as distinct editorial and literary practices. Reprinting was certainly widespread. One of the things that we've been able to learn from the millions of reprints that we have identified in the Viral Text Project is we've been able to just try to estimate how much of these newspapers was reprinted content. And we find that for basically the entirety of the 19th century, and this is an average, on average, more than 50% of papers at least was reprinted content. This is a conservative estimate because it's based on the reprints we've detected, and I suspect there are plenty more that we have not been able to detect. Some papers, it's as high as 90%. Other papers are more original content, but this is a kind of average across all of the newspapers that we have in our data. Let's get past that. All right. 19th century editors' attitude towards text reuse is exemplified in a selection that circulated in the last decade of the century, though often abbreviated from the version that I cite here. So when we trace reprinting, we find that things got changed quite a lot as they moved. They got shortened mostly, like they would get clipped and clipped and clipped and become shorter. This is a longer version. But this one insists that, quote, an editor's selections from his contemporaries are, quote, quite often the best test of his editorial ability, and that the function of his scissors are not merely to fill up vacant spaces, but to reproduce the brightest and best thoughts from all sources at the editor's command. While noting that sloppy or lazy selection will produce, quote, a stupid issue, this piece claims that just as often, quote, the editor opens up his exchanges and finds a feast for the eyes, heart, and soul, that his space is inadequate to contain. And the piece ends by insisting that, quote, a newspaper's real value is not the amount of original matter it contains, but the average quality of all the matter in its columns, whether original or selected. Looking at reprints of this piece, we see this other element of newspaper exchanges, that these texts were not only copied verbatim, but were modified as they circulated, sometimes shortened, sometimes only particular sections circulated widely. Details were changed to fit a particular paper's geographic location, audience, political stance, or special interest, and material might be added to contextualize or editorialized. The 19th century newspaper exemplifies ideas of textual originality, ownership, and malleability that harmonize with some 21st century media, particularly, I think, online social media, but which are markedly discordant with 21st century publishing, including 21st century newspaper publishing. For 19th century editors and compositors, the text of other newspapers was a store of words to be mined, manipulated, and reused at will. This historical text reuse was perhaps not as granular as what happens to training text being reworked in a large language model, but the key principle was pretty similar, drawing from a massive storehouse of words to generate content. I'm not saying this nostalgically. I'm not trying to downplay the dangers of large language models by reference to a historical precedent. Many of the same challenges that are posed by large language models were rampant in 19th century newspapers. Editors would note that items were, quote, going the rounds, but often worried whether the information in those texts was in fact reliable. As you can see in these examples, they qualify in many different ways. The following is going the rounds of the press, and we give it for what it is worth. It's a very, very neutral stance, perhaps. And then in some of these, we see some skepticism about the reliability of the text that is going the rounds. The textpocalypse that Matthew Kirschenbaum has recently warned us large language models might induce, I would suggest was already well underway in the, quote, ceaseless churn of the exchanges system. Just as our structural analyses and speculative bibliographies in the Viral Text Project have helped illuminate the material and cultural workings of the exchanges system, I want to suggest going forward in this talk that bibliography can offer insight into this dominant text reuse technology of our time. So I did name my talk somewhat ambitiously after T.F. McKenzie's talk. I felt a little bit nervous about doing that, given how important this article is. But in Bibliography and the Sociology of Text, which was first delivered in the 1985 Panizzi lectures and was later published in several books, D.F. McKenzie called for a radical reconsideration of the field of bibliography, both its critical orientation and its object of study. While bibliography already included several subfields, enumerative, descriptive, analytical, its work at the time was largely oriented towards textual editing. Bibliographers would collate multiple editions of particular works, largely concentrated on early modern European and American works, to triangulate their histories and determine, for instance, which textual changes seemed to emerge from the author's intentions and which arose through other means, such as printers or editors' errors. Often, bibliographic work was in service of preparing new or more reliable critical editions for use by other scholars. And many bibliographers who McKenzie quotes in his introduction were doing that kind of work. This account is, of course, a broad characterization, but it's this framework that McKenzie was challenging in Bibliography and Sociology of Text when he claimed that bibliography is the discipline that studies text as recorded forms and the processes of their transmission, including their production and reception. It allows us to describe not only the technical but the social processes of their transmission. In these quite specific ways, it accounts for non-book texts, their physical forms, textual versions, textual transmission, institutional control, their perceived meanings, and their social effects. And given this expanded purview, McKenzie claimed it would now be more useful to describe bibliography as the sociology of texts. More recently, Whitney Chrétien has advanced a, quote, shared formalist framework for describing the material structures of all technologies that mediate human culture. Through the terms substrate, platform, interface, and format, she attempts to outline a metric for comparison of media forms across time and discipline, including between analog and digital technologies, that, quote, contributes to collective efforts to research transdisciplinary histories of media and mediation. In this span between McKenzie and Chrétien, Darnton's in there as well, book history and bibliography alike have been oriented toward understanding and describing this complex interplay among technology, media, human labor, and creative expression in the production and reception of texts. And in the time remaining to me now, what I want to do is draw and extend these frameworks to account for the specific kind of media and mediation of large language models. I ground this account in bibliography and book history because large language models are both the products and the engines of producing non-book texts, and thus demand accounts of their physical forms, which, yes, they have, their textual versions, technical transmission, institutional control, their perceived meanings, and their social effects, all the things that McKenzie lists. We can trace a complex circuit from production through reception, from substrate through interface, that illuminates how these models are constructed and how the details of that construction determine their outputs. I also hope to show how the kinds of text reuse at play have precedence, if not precedence, in historical media, such as the newspaper exchanges of the 19th century. So the way I want to start that is by talking about a series of experiments we've been doing with large language models in the Viral Text Project, largely focusing on tasks like categorization or describing the historical newspaper data that we have. And as you'll see, some of these experiments have worked quite well, while others have not. And I want to attempt to show how methods drawn from bibliography and media archaeology can qualify and contextualize these kinds of experiments and offer some critical insight into the affordances and limitations of the models themselves. So my argument in brief will be, for a large language model to be a useful tool for bibliographical research, it must also be the subject of bibliographical inquiry and description. Okay, so this little bit is going to be less prepared remarks. I'm going to kind of walk through some of these experiments, and I'm going to start with genre. So I was showing our data or talking about our data, but this is what our data actually looks like, right? Massive spreadsheets of many, many millions of lines. Every line is one identified reprint that we have found. I asked David, my collaborator, for like our current stats. Right now we have 93 million distinct clusters of text, of which about 6 million of these are clusters of 10 or more reprints. There's a very long tail in our data. We have a lot of really small clusters, but even so, 6 million. And the reason that I highlight that is that while our project kind of started as a big data project, right, there's a massive amount of newspaper data, which is very difficult to just browse, right? You have to use computational methods to get at it. Our derived data now, our reprint data, is also too big to really effectively browse. I can't sit down and read all these texts, right? There's just too many of them. And so one of the central problems that we've been wrestling with for a while now is just how to get at the text that we're interested in. If I want to write about poetry, popular reprinted poetry, I have to be able to find the poems in our data. If I want to write about recipes, I have to find the recipes. And so we've done a lot of experiments over the years. This is many years ago. Jonathan, the PhD students who worked on the project, is now Salem State University. And we were doing kind of what we call conventional computational genre classification. This is where you get a lot of examples of a particular genre and you train a model with those examples, and then you apply that model to text that you don't know, and it will evaluate how likely or how unlikely it is that that text belongs to the genre that you've trained the model on, right? So we trained models for prose and poetry and news and lots of subgenres beyond that, did some experiments, and it was reasonably successful work. But part of the challenge here is that to do this, you have to have a corpus of all the genres that you want to train your model for in order to train your model to then go look for those. So we've done a lot of experiments over the years. We've written about some of this in one of the chapters of the book, which you can definitely go read. Recently, what we've been experimenting with is the degree to which we might be able to do some of this with an LLM, right? And so this started with, the thing that everyone was doing when large language models came out, was just throwing stuff at the wall a little bit, right? Just like taking textual data, passing it to the large language model and asking, like, what genre would you say this is? And, often if you do that, you get back maybe something useful, maybe not, but something quite verbose and like not actually that useful for computation. More recently, we've been working on ways of sort of constraining how we do this. So giving the model, fewer options in how it might respond. It's sort of a side note, but you'll notice that for a lot of these tasks, I'm using Llama. Llama is Meta's LLM. I'm not using it because I think Llama is particularly like better large language model than others. One reason I'm using it is because it's a convenient one that you can run locally on your computer rather than hitting the server every time you use it. There are other models that you can do this with, but a lot of these experiments are with Llama, right? So yeah, we started doing this, and the results were intriguing enough that I wanted to keep pursuing this to see whether this would be valuable. And in part, again, the goal here is we have millions of texts. Can we get at least a useful enough label on those texts that we can then use it just to browse and explore the data in a different way? Show me things that the model thinks are humor. Show me things that the model thinks are poetry. So that we can then look at them closely. Like, the goal here is not to create a kind of like statistically valid model of genre even, it's just to sort of explore the data more effectively. So one of the challenges that we are running into, which I'm going to talk more about, is that the data that we're sending to the model is not like clean transcribed text. It is OCR generated text. So it has all of the lovely weirdnesses that OCR brings in the text. And so that's going to mess a little bit with these processes, right? But we can then begin to do things but like, all right, what is the general breakdown of genres across, our clusters and things like that based on the model? All right, some of you in the room that are already anticipating some of the reasons this would be problematic, which is, how do I know that these tags are any good, right? And so recently, what I've been doing is trying to evaluate that question, right? People have thoughts about how reliable we know about the problem of hallucinations, et cetera. Is it actually tagging these genres in a way that we would find reliable? Is it just making up labels? How much should I trust the labels that I'm getting? So I've been working with Emma Ermish, who's an English PhD student. And basically, the way that we did this experiment is we went and we hand tagged about 2,000 texts a piece. And then the first thing that we did was just see how much do we agree with each other? What is our inter-rater reliability? We had two different ways of thinking about genre, because one of the theories that I had at play is that even with more conventional computational classification, the fine-grained genre distinctions can sometimes get really messy and maybe less reliable. So we both had a kind of like fine-grained division of genres, and then we have a simplified division of genres, right? Which is going to come into play here. This is about how much we agreed, which is to say, even the two humans were not 100% in alignment. Like, we tried to do very little prompting. We had one session where we got together and I kind of talked through, how do I understand these genres? How should you be thinking about the genres? And then we went off and tagged independently, and then just came back and looked at our differences. Most of our disagreements were around genres that have a fairly fine distinction between them, right? So what is the difference between a political text and news? Like, I had kind of talked through how I saw that distinction, but it gets really messy even for me. As I was tagging, I was like, oh, is that what I said I meant by political, or is that what I meant when I said news? I don't know. Most of our disagreements, political news, commercial news, this is where the same disagreement in the opposite direction, et cetera, right? So, here are a few texts where we disagreed with each other, where one of us called it informational, the other called it domestic. It's essentially a recipe to make your own toilet water. If you need a recipe for toilet water, I've got one for you. One of us called it an informational text, one of us called it a domestic text. And then down here, anecdote and humor, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later. When we simplify the genres a bit, our agreement was considerably better, right? The smaller list of genres, the more constrained list of genres, we had far fewer disagreements. But this is like the general inter-rater reliability going into the experiment. And then from here, we started to do tagging. And so for those who maybe have not done work with any of these models before, I will explain what I mean. So zero shot. What this means is that I really provide no context to the model at all. I simply give it a list of genres and ask it to tag using that list. I'm not providing it any examples of the genres that I'm asking it. And you can see that it did pretty poorly there. We mostly disagreed with the humans in this process, right? One shot, I'm basically giving it one example of every category, right? But I am giving it an example to build on of what I mean by each category, and the agreement gets a little bit better. Where does it disagree with the humans? You will see some similarities, right? News and political, that distinction remains a tricky distinction. Anecdote and humor, which I'm going to come back to in a bit. News and political, et cetera, right? So some of the same general areas where the humans were a little bit uncertain with each other, we are a little uncertain if we compare the model against a human rater. If we look at the simple genres, and again, zero shot, so providing it with no examples, a little better, fewer genres to choose from, it gets a little bit better. If I give it at least one example of every genre with the simplified genres, it's getting actually fairly close to our initial human agreement. And I actually have not fully figured out why it gets worse when I give it more examples. I need to dig into this a little bit more, right? All right. Why is this interesting? I'm going to get into what this maybe tells us bibliographically. But for me, a lot of this has to do with my goals. If my goal is to create a kind of gold standard labeling of all these genres, I don't know that this is sufficient, right? But if my goal is, for instance, to use text that the human and the model agreed on to then go build a more standard classifier, then this is perhaps a valuable way of at least doing a little bit more with the very limited funds that we have, or something of that nature, right? As an exploratory tool, I think it's or potentially valuable for navigating. But what I really want to do to interpret the results of this classification is to understand what happens when we ask a large language model to classify a text. So again, in a conventional model, right, I would provide a lot of examples to the model in order to get it to recognize that genre. So for instance, another one of our researchers, Avery Blankenship, was interested in culinary writing. And she basically took a lot of recipes, 19th century recipes, provided those to the model, and then applied that to our newspaper text in order to find texts that were likely to be culinary texts. She's written about that a little bit. She had an article that came out in Cultural Analytics about this work last year. So here, the words in those recipes that she provide become predictive of recipiness when the model is applied to unknown text. And one thing that's very interesting is that Avery found, quote, the structure of recipes leans less into food words, which can vary significantly region to region and from culinary style to culinary style, and more so on instructional and measurement words. So the thing that is consistent across the category recipe are the measurement words and the instructional words, not the food itself, right? Which might be the thing that we as humans think is key to recipes. And because of that, Avery's model also surfaced many parodies, such as a recipe for cooking husbands, which is not about cooking anything really, but uses the structure of a recipe to make a satirical point about domestic life and marriage. But it uses a lot of those instructional words and the measurement words, and so it gets classified. And this is actually part of what she writes about, that this was valuable in her research process. But this is not quite what happens when we ask a large language model to label the genres of a provided text. No human has subdivided the model's training data into distinct genres, tagging poems as poems or jokes as jokes. And so it's not comparing the language of a provided text against the language from a known category called poem or joke. So if we look at this sturdy beggar text, this is, I'm going to call it a joke. I said 19th century humor doesn't translate well. A sturdy beggar who asked that a coat was given one that was slightly threadbare and minus a single button. The applicant for charity passed it back, offended dignity. Madam, I want a coat that I should not be ashamed to wear in the daytime. His would-be benefited him in amazement and then retired to repair the garment for the use of her own husband. All right, whether this is funny or not really doesn't matter. It is a joke, I promise. It is an example that makes plain the slippage between human understandings of genre. Many humorous texts are structured as anecdotes, but not all jokes are anecdotes, nor are all anecdotes humorous. Like these are Venn diagrams, but they don't overlap precisely. In our research team discussions, we decided that anything with a punchline should be humor, leaving the category of anecdote for pieces with morals or socio-political commentary. For a large language model, though, what constitutes a genre is not a philosophical question, but a structural question. I would argue a bibliographical question. Its representation of genre is a distinctive statistical pattern, a cluster of closely associated words. Their relationships weighted based on how often they are used together and in what order and in what context. It's also a sociological question because those weights have been shaped not only by algorithmic processes, but by input from human labelers who are evaluating the model's responses over time. So if we were going to draw a communication circuit, sorry, I'm getting lost. Notably, the text data itself, the addition of the text that we actually pass to the large language model is created through optical character recognition so that the beggar asks at a clergyman's bouse, and the coat is minus a single batu, right? So these are confounding factors a little bit. And that small detail is important to this account of how the text is analyzed. So I'm going to create a vastly oversimplified view of this joke, focused on its adjectives, nouns, and key verbs. And I often joke that 19th century newspaper humor is opaque to my students, but there's a good reason for that. Humor is historically and culturally specific, often specific not just to a particular generation, but to smaller cultural, professional, or other communities. The key words and phrases in this joke, sturdy beggar, clergyman, threadbare, charity, dignity, madam, garment, immediately mark this as antiquated for a 21st century reader. Like my students, llama and the vast majority of large language models, which is a 21st century reader, it's going to be really opaque. So I've talked about, the model is not interpreting the text, but comparing specific patterns of token distribution and semantic transitions. What comprises the model's semantic spaces for something we might call a joke or an anecdote depends on its training data, which is why so many discussions of large language models wind their way back to the question of what text was used to train them. I might say that what makes something a joke is a setup followed by a punchline, but from the perspective of a language model, that might be expressed as an initial text segment with relatively predictable token sequences, a second text segment with tokens that have a low probability relative to the first segment, and a final segment containing words from semantic fields distant from those in the initial segment. I'm trying to think about this structurally, right? What constitutes predictable and unpredictable, however, entirely depends on the relationship between tokens in that training data. So a lot of this is a black box. I've talked a little bit about how I think we can unpack that black box in previous works. I'm not going to just repeat all of that. But one thing that we know, right, is that an enormous amount of the training data in these models comes from Common Crawl, which is a selection of open source, largely open source web pages that have been crawled since 2008. WebText 2, which is a smaller collection, curated selection of content, including the text of all URLs shared through Reddit posts and given at least 3 upvotes. That's a big part of WebText 2. These books 1, 2, and now there's a books 3 and maybe a books 4 corpus as well. This has been a part of the discussion around copyrighted works lately. And we also know that Wikipedia is a huge part of a lot of the training data. And there's a lot of other folks trying to unpack all the other pieces of this right now. And these corpora include significant social media data from various open sites, including Reddit. And so if we try to imagine the semantic space of humor created through training data like this, we might begin to suspect that it will be quite distant from words like beggar, madam, and garment. While the books in the corpora do include older texts from collections such as Project Gutenberg, that material is dwarfed by more contemporary material, particularly for genres like humor, where we might predict social media, Reddit, and similar websites to be determinative. So recent work from folks in this room, such as Melanie Wallace and Anna Proust and Elizabeth Gronsky, have shown that the iterative generation of poetry can expose, quote, default poetic mode in GPT models, which favors quatrains, iambic meter, and end rhyme, evidencing through those patterns the hyper-canonical and anthologized status of much of the poetry in the model's training data. So similarly, if we iteratively generate humor or anecdote texts, we immediately see how determinative social media posts are to constructing the model's construction of the former. So without any additional nudging, it's in fact difficult to get Llama to generate a short humorous paragraph that is not about a cat. I just don't, I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of iterations and probably half of them are about cats. I just want to emphasize that. Conversely, without additional guidance, generated anecdotes seem to all be about family vacations to national parks, with occasional stories about school. This is really simplified. I'm just trying to illustration of what I mean here, but I'm trying to just sort of envision what is the semantic neighborhood of these two genres as I'm kind of passing a text to it and asking, what is it nearest to? Like, what is the calculation here? The anecdotes are longer, they're more literary, they have more descriptive words, such as adjectives and adverbs than most of the humor that's generated. They are more Tumblr than Reddit, if we were going to make a kind of comparison. And I'm not quite ready to show the graphs from this work yet, but we are finding that if we iteratively generate jokes, they diverge much more sharply from the humor that we tag in these 19th century texts than many of the other genres in our set do. Just the statistical relationships are much further away. If we try to imagine these as neighborhoods within these sort of like webs of association. I want to kind of pace myself.
What, 20-ish?
Cool. All right. Great. Brilliant. Okay. So, all right. So the main thing that I'm trying to get at is that like having a structural understanding of how the training data then gets sort of built into these word associations can help us give a sense of why certain genres may be more reliable to use this method with than others, right? And I think humor in particular diverges quite far from our 19th century texts because of that historical specificity. So the other experiment that I want to talk about, this is a side project. A few years ago, in the Viral Text Project, we were approached by colleagues at the Racial Violence Archive at Washington University in St. Louis, not the University of Washington, the other one. And they wanted to know whether our text reuse methods might be useful for tracing reporting about incidents of racial violence in US newspapers, particularly white violence against Black communities, but other forms of racialized violence as well. And we were fortunate to get funding from the Mellon Foundation to work on this. And we've been doing a lot of different experiments, not all related to machine learning and AI. But I want to point to a few because I think that they give us an interesting way to think bibliographically about some of the aspects of the models. So a lot of the newspaper data that we work with is not subdivided by article. So you have a whole page of data. And one of the challenges even initially with the Viral Text Project was we wanted to identify these little segments of reprinted text within these much larger segments of kind of undifferentiated or unmarked text. And there's something similar happening here. We want to find these little moments on the newspaper page that seem to be describing an incident of racial violence within a much larger block of text. And so one of the experiments that we've done, or we've done variations of this, is simply passing pages of newspaper data to a model and asking it whether within that page it can identify a segment of text that seems to be describing an incident of racial violence. There's been some useful work that's come out of this. One of our PhD students, Jess Fry, was finding in quite interesting ways that this is another one of those mistakes that's potentially generative, that the model was both finding incidents of racial violence and also incidents of anti-union violence. The language in those two kinds of text was very similar in ways that the model was kind of conflating them, but that's actually very relevant to her work, which is on Appalachia. And so you can see some examples of this, right? So we've passed newspaper data to it, and it's just trying to identify if there's anything on the page that seems to be describing an incident of racial violence. The thing that I really want to focus on here, though, is that this experiment has been far less sort of promising ultimately than the experiments with genre classification, at least using some of the off-the-shelf models like Llama and GPT and some of the other ones. This would be maybe different if we built our own model, which is something we've been thinking about. Because often we find we have pages where we have, in fact, very clearly evidence of racialized violence on the page, and the model will say, I don't see anything on this page. And we got really interested about why this was happening. And as we dug into it, we figured out, sorry, I don't want to go to that slide yet. We basically figured out that if there was any very explicitly racist language on the page, the model would often report that it saw nothing. All right. And we believe that what is going on, and I'm going to get to this in a second, is that some of the filters that are added sort of on top of the models to prevent them from generating hate speech also make it where they will not identify hate speech on a page if you're actually looking for that to do this kind of analysis. Quickly, before I get to that, I want to highlight some of Matthew Colmer's work. Matthew built a really wonderful pipeline that was taking data from the NAACP that was compiled in the late 19th and early 20th century, or from the late 19th and early 20th century on lynchings in the United States. They compiled a lot of data about this and basically built a pipeline that uses the metadata in those databases to go back and try to identify all the newspaper coverage of those incidents that we can find in any of our newspaper data from the year prior and the year following the incident itself. This is difficult work. It's difficult to read sometimes, but actually being able to not just identify the incident itself, but the way that reporting about those incidents spread is one of the things that he's really been focusing on. The main reason I'm bringing it up here is that one of the things that he is doing is using BERT, basically, because with names, right, you would imagine you also get a lot of false positives. A lot of people share the same name. So he is using BERT to basically evaluate whether the incidents that he's finding seem to actually be related to an incident of racial violence or not, essentially as a filter on the data. And this has been quite reliable. We've done some evaluations of this, and it seems really promising. This data is all quite freely available. I'm happy to pass this on to anyone who is interested. This is maybe the more promising approach that we've had, as opposed to some of the experiments with large language models, which have not yet been actually very promising. So to understand why a large language model might fail to identify articles that are clearly about racial violence as about racial violence, we have to move beyond the initial training of the model, the training data itself, and think about the larger set of humans that are involved in this particular communication circuit. If we were going to draw a diagram, like Robert Darnton's famous diagram of the communication circuit, there would actually be circuits within circuits, because all of the training corpora have their own circuit of authors and publishers and editors, and then there's all the people who digitized all of those things. But it would also have to include people like the human labelers who have evaluated iteratively the responses that they get to the model, because these labels then feed back into the weights of the model and change the kind of outputs that we get. It would also have to connect the workers, typically in the global south, who are paid very little, to manually tag examples of racist, sexist, homophobic, or other topical texts so that those can be used to create a detector, essentially a classification model that would prevent the model from generating such content. This is one of the main things that I think is actually preventing this from working with the VRT project. Most of the major AI companies have built these guardrails to prevent the chat interfaces from spewing hate speech. I think in general that we probably want them to not spew hate speech, or teaching users to build bombs, or any number of other problematic interactions that we could imagine happening on those platforms. And of course, we've also read lots of examples of people trying to find ways to get around those guardrails. This is like a big part of the AI discourse right now. At one level, this seems like a laudable goal for anything that's going to be provided to the general public. But as scholars such as Sophia Noble and Kathy O'Neill and Emily Bender have shown, the way that algorithmic and machine learning systems perpetuate and exacerbate racial, gender, and other biases are really not fully addressed by these kinds of guardrails. And we are seeing this dramatically illustrated in the ways that Doge has been using generative AI over the past few months. But for the public interfaces of models like Claude or ChatGPT, I suspect we prefer a world where companies attempt to filter toxic language over one where they do not. But a bibliography of large language models has to account for these human layers that shape both the input and the output of large language models and consider how these technosocial systems shape the tasks that we might undertake using them. In the case of our experiments for the Virality of Racial Terror project, we began to suspect quite early that these guardrails were perhaps ironically preventing the model from recognizing racialized violence in the newspaper. For example, 19th century newspapers frequently made use of the N-word, both explicitly in white supremacist papers and also in the mainstream press, often in racist jokes, but also in their reporting about lynchings and other similar events. And our experiments are finding that these LLMs will essentially not report any of that. They just will not report it back to you. Again, an understandable reason, but one that you would need to know if you were going to try to bring this technology and use it for a project like this, right? There's a structural feature of the model that's interfering directly with the research using that model in the ways that a scholar who is unfamiliar with the layers of training might entirely miss. The last thing that I want to show is something that's quite new. It's really just like 2 weeks old at this point, and something that I still don't have a fully developed sort of theory of, but I do want to share it. So I mentioned that we have a database of all of our clusters that you can go and search. You can go look to see if there are any reprints of a text that you're interested in. All of this is hosted at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which is at the University of Illinois. They've been quite wonderful in sort of helping us get this infrastructure up and running. And a couple of weeks ago, my colleague at the NCSA wrote me and said, hey, I was just reading about Claude and how you can build hooks from Claude into specific databases. And so I built a hook from Claude into your viral text data. Let me know what you think. That was the email. I didn't ask him to do this. He just like did it for fun, I think. And so I've been experimenting with this. And I find this quite interesting. I'm pretty skeptical of general like chat interfaces for large language models. We are all well aware of all the problems with students using these for writing, for coding, for all of these kinds of things. And all of our fields are sort of scrambling to reckon with that. But this is something quite different. This is not using Claude to just sort of provide information to the web. What's happening here is we're using it to query a very particular database, right? And so essentially using it as an alternative chat interface or search interface into the data. So in this case, right, I asked it to identify any clusters that seem to be about automatic typesetting machines from the 19th century, like what I started with, and to give me a kind of summary of its findings, but also importantly, to give me the cluster IDs of any clusters that it found that would be relevant to this research. And thus far, this has been quite intriguing to me, actually, because with the constraint of I only want you to essentially query this database, it's doing something that I as a human researcher might do. It's just iterating through search results and kind of reporting back what it's finding. But frankly, it's finding stuff that I didn't find when I was doing this myself. And thus far, all of the clusters it's reporting, I'm not finding the kinds of hallucinations and things that we worry. It's actually quite reliable with reporting the clusters that it's citing. And I'm finding this a kind of an intriguing possibility for not a large language model in some ways, but a slightly smaller one. Part of my argument is actually, I think we need more models to compare against. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have going right now is that so many of the models out there are essentially trained on roughly the same data. They sound very much the same in my sort of opinion. And I think it's actually hard to convey to students what's happening under the hood because they are so similar. There was this interesting experiment called Monad GPT that was a model fine-tuned on 17th century books that was fascinating because it responded as a model trained on 17th century books. And I think that it really dramatically illustrated this concept of how the training data influences the output. Actually hard to see when you compare GPT to Claude or GPT to Copilot, one of the others, right? because it was so dramatically different. If you asked it for health advice, it would, refer to your humor. It was like really respectful to the king and things like that, right? It was like so dramatically different. And I actually think that like models trained on specific historical periods, fields, will make it easier to teach literacy about models. So, and this is not quite that. This is still Claude, right? This is still, but when I'm using it to query this very specific historical database, I find it a really quite dramatically different experience than just asking it to generate text. This is a different use. So I'm going to kind of conclude by saying that a central challenge to bibliographic investigation of large language models is that the companies who build and deploy them have little interest in making their data systems or infrastructure transparent. But I would argue that bibliographic methods were first developed to make predictions about a text material construction, editing, and significance from clues that were rooted in historical systems of production, the infrastructure of print culture, the signatures, chain lines, and watermarks, and these other physical clues that bibliographers use in order to understand books were not placed in those books deliberately by papermakers, printers, or binders to facilitate the work of historians. They were not putting them there for us, right? Instead, these are artifacts of production, of papermaking, of printing, of binding that scholars have discovered could be excavated in the archaeological sense or reverse engineered in the technical sense to analyze the details of that production. Similarly to books in the printing press era or documents in the word processing era, these large language models are not constructed with an eye towards transparency or material analyses, but they leave clues that can be collated and theorized. I've only gestured towards some of these clues today. And in these disagreements over genre that you saw in some of the examples that I was giving, we can tease out elements of the model's underpinnings that usefully qualify our research using these tools while also contributing to a richer understanding of the models themselves. Bringing together bibliographical and computational approaches allows us to perceive AI systems not as unknowable oracles, but instead as bound, describable, and comparable cultural artifacts. Bibliography's close attention to understanding and describing the material, technological, economic, and social facets of cultural production are precisely what is needed to understand the shifts we are undergoing and to advocate for more transparency and responsive systems in the future. The textual histories in which bibliographers are expert can also contribute desperately needed nuance to our understanding of the sociocultural impacts of these new systems. In making this argument, I'm not trying to claim large language models for bibliography, and there are certainly other AI systems that demand distinct expertise. But to the extent that language models are textual media that both draw on and contribute to book culture, they should be the provenance of bibliographers working in close collaboration with computer scientists, information scientists, technologists, and related experts. AI systems require a bibliography that takes seriously the diffuse and often obscured sociology of textual data. Thank you.
So much.
Yeah, my question actually is beginning of your